Good morning, class. This week for Introduction to Psychology, we will be looking at conditioning and learning. We're going to spend the majority of the class time kind of discussing classical conditioning and operant conditioning, two of the pretty much seminal theories about how we learn that came out of the 20th century. And then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at other forms of learning. With our midterm coming up, we're kind of cutting the learning sections into different portions. With our midterm coming up next week, we will be obviously having a break from the video lectures, but what will be coming after that will be some sections on memory and intelligence, where we discuss more cognitive learning. Kind of to that effect, I know I actually probably said a little bit last week how we were going to have the midterm this week. I know I did my other class for sure. But my apologies for that. I just kind of had my weeks crossed. So our midterm will be next week. That's why it's always important to look at the syllabus in case I ever happen to get tongue-tied. And as we kind of discussed, the midterm is going to be something of a 10 short answer questions that are somewhat reminiscent of our weekly quizzes. And then we're going to have 2 longer essay questions that are a little bit more reminiscent of our assignments, where I'm asking you guys to give a more full sort of essay format answer. That being said, we're not talking like a 5-paragraph essay or anything. Just a sort of like full paragraph essay, not anything that's designed to take you half a day to write. Test time, just to remind people, is going to be untimed. You should be able to start and stop, though I would like you guys to. I've had students that have tried to stop and in actuality submitted instead of stopping, and weird things have gone down, and that always causes problems. So if you can do it in one sitting, please do so. Another little trick is as long as you leave it open, it doesn't submit it, so you can just keep going. There is no timer on it. It's open note, open text. You can use pretty much any resource at hand, just not each other. That being said, for any resource you use, do not plagiarize. The sort of kind of lapses where I let you guys regurgitate answers kind of rote style on a quiz will not fly on a midterm. So, if you're just copying a PowerPoint slide as an answer for a midterm, that's plagiarism. That's not putting an answer in your own words. I want you guys to be able to answer these in your own terminology and your own phrasing. So I want to make sure that we are clear on that, which is what I'm telling you right now. When it comes to the midterm, do not just copy and paste anything. And it will be inordinately easy. Hopefully we remember from our first lecture of the week where we just copy and paste, and through a simple Google search is pretty much able to find anywhere on the internet you would have pulled up information from. And that includes textbooks, because these textbooks have been digitized. And so they can search through all the textbooks that are in a Google Books database and learning databases. So copy and pasting is a very, very dangerous way to go about a midterm, because the penalties for plagiarism have been thoroughly outlined. Phrasing it in your own terminology while saying pretty much the exact same thing, that's great. It's just that difference between being able to write it and put it in your own words, which demonstrates that you're not just hitting Control-C, Control-V. Okay. I guess that's enough about that. We've done a good job again with our quizzes, our assignments, our discussion board topics. Thank you so much for staying on top of those. I'm going to be getting to the gradings and getting everything trying to get done for the midterms. Oh, lastly, when it comes to the midterm itself, again, a reminder, I have midterm grades due the next Tuesday or Wednesday. It's pretty quick. It's pretty quick after the midterm itself. The positive side of the way I do things without having it timed is that I give you guys as much time as possible to get your work in and get your work done. And so I think that's, my good on me. I do what I can to make it flexible for your schedule, because this is what all online classes are all about. Downside of this is that since I let you guys take the midterm all the way up till Sunday night, if you wait till Sunday night and something goes wrong, not only will you probably not be able to get a response from me other than we can deal with this later, but you're going to lose points, and you may even have like a midterm F. Just because if I don't have a grade for you and it's something that you waited to the last minute on, I'm going to give you a 0 and report it, that you just didn't get the midterm in time. We may be able to finish it later with some sort of penalty, but if you're waiting to the last minute, remember, since I'm giving you 7 days or so to get this done, I'm going to put it up on a Monday. You'll have till Sunday night. Yet again, my computer isn't working is not going to be a valid excuse. I will penalize you guys. I've had several people in my classes this semester email me about this, and this is one of the things I'm really trying to work on, is kind of like being stern on this, because in an online class, I have so many of you guys are doing such a great job getting everything in on a regular basis every week in a timely fashion. The few that are just kind of like emailing me on a Monday or Tuesday afterwards saying, oh, my computer's not working, I'm not giving you a whole lot of leniency, because the rest of your class is being really diligent and working really hard to get stuff in on time. So the midterms are going to be the same way. Getting stuff in on time is a big deal. It's part of what we're doing here in this online class format. So I just recommend that everyone get to the midterm as soon as they can. I make it straightforward. I make it simple. It's just, do you know the material? Have you stayed up with the readings? Have you stayed up with the video lectures? And if you can do those things, then you're going to fly. You're going to coast through it. If you were way behind, take this week to catch up. If you're way behind, take this week to catch up. Check out all the discussion board topics, just because that's going to be a part of it, like knowing that material. Check out all the video lectures. That's going to be super important. Read your chapters. That's going to be super important. So be familiar with where the knowledge is. You don't even have to know everything, since you can pull the book as a reference. You just need to know where to get the information. Okay, so that long-windedness aside about the midterm, I just hope you guys are prepared and do well, because I want you to do well. Let's talk a little bit about learning, because that's what this chapter is all about. When we start to get into classical conditioning and operant conditioning, keep in mind that this is really all about this question of how do we learn. And learning is, a tricky thing. Learning is once you basically start to develop habits or knowledge patterns or skills that take place over time. But there's this kind of like debate over how do people learn, how do people enter into this world. I think we've used this term before in this class, a tabula rasa, which comes from old philosophical debates of a blank slate. It's a John Locke term. This idea that people are born as this blank slate, and that we start to etch knowledge into that blank slate, and that is what comprises a person. It's a very sort of like empirical, idealistic expectation of what a person is, that we can just fill their head up with all sorts of good things. But at the same time, there's a lot of people that say, well, what about nurture? What about genetics? What about predispositions of society, of culture? How do we actually enter into anything as a blank slate with all of these contingencies weighing upon us? And that may be a question that we just have to leave hanging for now, because while there is a sort of debate on this, how much of a blank slate, though probably most people today would say that we're not a pure blank slate, even just from our basic genetics. There are influencing factors that either limit or encourage. What country we come from is obviously a sort of limit or encouragement for certain types of knowledge and what we'll be able to learn. Kind of saying that maybe we're not a blank slate, maybe we're a type of form waiting to be filled out. And how that form is filled out could be determined by our culture, our family, our genetics, and all these other sorts of, again, contingencies that just kind of come in and out of play on a regular basis. But, the philosophical debates aside, we do have this debate about how we start to fill up that tabula rasa. And keep in mind that when we're talking about these various associative forms and cognitive forms, these are not in opposition of one another, but these are complementary to one another. When we talk about classical conditioning and operant conditioning, it's not do we learn through one way or the other, but instead we learn through both and. Now, when we're talking about, as our text lists, there are two types of learning, associative and cognitive. And remember, this is not saying that there's not other ways of knowing things like intuition, things like instinct. But this is kind of like a psychological breakdown, a description of how we're learning at a sort of aggregate level. Because, we got to remember those original 4 aims of psychology. Part of it is to be able to describe and understand. And so this is what we're doing here. We're describing and understanding some of the various ways that predominantly people learn. And when we're talking about associative learning, this is a call and response stimuli. Something happens, therefore something else happens. It's not something that's oftentimes happening as a sort of planned, outlined, cognitive, reasoned measure. Instead, when we're talking about call and response stimuli, it's almost like, if a breath of cold air brushes across your arm, your hairs stand up. There's nothing to that. That's nothing to that from a cognitive level. Instead, that's all associative. Cold air might cause goosebumps to pop up on your arm. This is not something that we have to sit and think about. Instead, one thing happens, another thing happens in conjunction with it. And this is very different from cognitive functioning, which, again, we're going to touch on just a little bit at the end of the lecture today, but we're also saving for the weeks ahead. So very, very different sorts of ways that we go about learning. One is very instantaneous. It's very instantaneous. It's very in the moment. The other is the type of thing that we talk about from a education. There's an education for. So let's look at associative learning a little bit more in detail. And this is where we get classical conditioning and operant conditioning. When we're talking about classical conditioning, these are the two kind of like main forms of instinctual learning that psychologists describe. And classical conditioning is something that we're going to talk about a little bit in our assignments and our discussion boards. It's made famous through Pavlov and his dog experiment. But this is a form of associative learning where you have one basic stimulus that is added onto another sequence of events so that you condition yourself to associate the added stimulus to the original sequence of events. So keep that in mind. There's several different things here that are going on, and we kind of broke them down into some of the terms here between the unconditioned stimulus and neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus. And to kind of break it down, let's look at Pavlov and his dogs. Some of you may already be familiar with this. If you've looked at our assignment this week, you'll be familiar with this as well. But essentially, Pavlov had these sets of dogs, and what he did was every time he fed the dog, he rang a bell. Now, when you throw down a bunch of food for a dog, or if you guys have a dog or cat, you can if that dog or if that pet of yours is hungry, they kind of like rush in all excited, and like my cat's terrible. I put one scoop of food into his bowl and then he dives in. I'm like, but we have another scoop coming. Come on, buddy, move your head out of the way. And sometimes you feel like, no, I don't even care, and you pour the food right on top of him. He's like, seriously? And you're like, dude, come on, man, gotta move. But they get that sort of over eagerness. when it's feeding time. And this is a sort of unconditioned stimulus. And for the dogs, what happens is they produce a sort of salivation. And this, food being served and a dog salivating is something that just happens. It happens without condition. It happens whether Pavlov is there, if these dogs are wild, if these dogs are, owned. It doesn't matter. It's an unconditioned stimulus, something that a dog does naturally. And it's true pretty much for all dogs. In that, there's nothing you have to do. When they sense the food, they smell that food, they're going to start salivating. Now, and this is also what I call a sequence of events. So it's an unconditioned stimulus, a sequence of events. Something is happening, producing another result completely outside your control. Then what Pavlov did was introduce a neutral stimulus, which is the ringing of the bell. Go to your dog right now, if you guys are around it, and, ring a bell. Will that produce any sort of response in the dog? It might get the dog to turn and listen and be like, oh, is there something there? But that's no different from, a door slamming, a car backfiring. A sharp sound produces a response, but it's not going to produce the response of the dog salivating. That's a different unconditioned stimulus. And so, what Pavlov does is he puts this neutral stimulus of ringing a bell, which has nothing to do with the dog salivating for food, and he rings the bell every time he gives the dog the food. And so what ends up happening over time is that the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. And so every time that bell rings, the dog hears the bell, and it knows the food's coming. And now it starts to salivate. And so this neutral stimulus, this ringing the bell, which would normally have nothing to do with the dog salivating, gets conditioned through repetition to be associated with the salivation for food. And now we have a case of classical conditioning. A conditioned stimulus has been created. And so every time Pavlov would ring that bell, the dog would start to salivate because the food was supposed to be coming. And so even in times when he wouldn't bring the food, instead he would ring the bell, the dog would still start to salivate as if the unconditioned stimulus was taking place. So the unconditioned stimulus of, ooh, there's food, I'm going to salivate, gets sublimated into this sort of conditioned stimulus of the bell rings and now the dog salivates. And this sort of partnering of building stimulus with unconditioned stimulus is the sort of thing that functions as the centerpiece of classical conditioning. It's a type of associative learning where you have one basic stimulus that is added to another sequence of events so that you might condition yourself to associate these events. In some ways, this is kind of like the transitive property. Now, this sort of conditioned stimulus can in fact lead to other conditioned stimulus or stimuli. And this is what we call higher order conditioning. If you were to add a second function onto the ringing of the bell, like say maybe pat the dog on the back. Pat the dog on the back and you ring the bell and the food comes. What then becomes a step one process becomes a multi-step process, and our conditioning starts to work itself out. You're able to add on multiple orders of this. So what does this mean for our regular day-to-day life? How does this sort of conditioning work? Well, I think it works in a lot of instinctual ways, and we'll talk about this when it comes to emotional conditioning, vicarious conditioning, fear responses, that sort of disgust response with gross foods, pain responses. These are all forms of classical conditioning, and they're also forms of apparent conditioning in different ways. But kind of just a regular analysis would be something like drinking coffee. Um, Now, from an operant standpoint, when we start talking about that, that means you're going to start putting that caffeine into your brain. You're going to start feeling good. Oh yeah, your mind's going to be all loosened up, and everything's going to be great. Reality is, when you put caffeine in your body, it's going to take about 20 minutes or so to hit that bloodstream. So before you actually start to feel anything from a chemical standpoint, you can observe in many coffee drinkers the feeling of something before they actually start feeling things. That smell of coffee, fresh coffee in the morning, it just kind of stirs them up and fills them with a positive feeling. They take that sip, and that, I'm obviously a coffee drinker, so that's why I can speak of this with such confidence. You take that first sip, and that, kind of bitter black material goes down your throat, and you just have that very positive sort of exhale. You haven't actually infused your blood with caffeine at that point, but you're getting a conditioned response. You're getting a conditioned stimulus before the biological stimulus has actually taken place. And this takes place because that good feeling of relaxation, of clarity of thought, of waking up that comes with drinking caffeine in the morning, and comes with drinking coffee in the morning. And so you have all these additional stimuli, the smell, the taste, and they start to provide that same sort of response that the unconditioned stimulus might have had already, which is caffeine actually entering your bloodstream. But you can start feeling better before the caffeine actually hits. The second you put coffee in your mouth, caffeine is not hitting. But you can still have that conditioned stimulus regardless. And that's kind of like what classical conditioning is doing for us. It's associating different stimuli together so that the result that might be produced by drinking coffee is also being produced by the smelling of the coffee, the tasting of the coffee, even before the actual contact between the caffeine chemical and our bloodstream. And this also takes place when we think about like emotional conditioning. Or and emotional conditioning, whether it's like fear or sadness, where you might have had a sort of, I'll say for myself, emotional time period when I had a long bout of depression, and I've talked about insomnia a little bit. One of the things that I used to do a lot during that time period was listen to Nick Drake, who is this musician from like the 60s and 70s, and met a very tragic end. But his music was very soothing and relaxing. But now if I start to listen to it, I trigger emotional responses, even though I'm not in the emotional state I was when I first came to listen to him so fervently. I can find myself having those sort of emotional stimulus take place when I listen to him now. So I may not be sad, but if the song comes on, it can trigger a bunch of emotions, a bunch of memories, and this is all part of emotional conditioning. One of the things that we associate very firmly with conditioning is smells. It has a very, very powerful affect on our emotional state, our memory state, our cognitive states. And so the way we smell things, smell might be a very positive reinforcer for this sort of a positive conditioned stimulus to bring back all of these other stimuli as well. Another way that classical conditioning operates is what we call vicarious conditioning. And by that we mean not learning through necessarily our experiences, but by the experiences of others. So seeing other people go through something and saying, man, that must be painful. For guys in the class, I know this is kind of a crass example, but if you've ever seen a guy kind of like get hit in the nuts, rack themselves, whether intentionally or through sports contact or something, you see the thing take place, you see the pain, and then you have a conditioned response where you feel a sort of like phantom analogous pain. And you wince. You have that wince. I mean, you didn't get hit, but through the sort of vicarious conditioning of another, you still wince nonetheless. And this sort of vicarious conditioning, is one of those things that also functions in a higher level for empathy. But it's also a great way of how we kind of like form associative connections between people and ourselves, and learn about things from a sort of like social standpoint, because we're seeing stuff reinforced over and over and over. Not necessarily to ourselves, but we're able to learn from the multiplicity of events that are taking place all around us. And that's kind of through that process of vicarious conditioning. Now, let's look for a minute at operant conditioning. Whereas classical conditioning, I don't know why my voice jumped up so much there, but classical conditioning is this moment where we start to associate a neutral stimulus with an unconditional stimulus. Operant conditioning works in a very different way. It's kind of just associating more directly, actions with outcomes, actions and outcomes. Like, for example, a very extreme case, if you were to stick your finger into an electric socket, like a paper clip, that's a good one actually, because this happened every so often in the high school I grew up at, where someone would, go stick their paper clip or a staple into an electric socket, learning very quickly all the lessons that they should have been learning from their physics class. Oddly enough, it happened repeatedly in the science classrooms because they had those electrical outlets everywhere for people to not play with, but plug useful tools into. But yeah, so they would invariably get a sort of reinforcement in the form of like a punishment at that moment. And thus have this sort of operant conditioning to be like, wow, maybe that is not a good thing to do. But that is the sort of conditioning that takes place at the operant level instead of at the classical level. You have an action, you receive a response, and based on that response, you decide that maybe we should either continue to do that action more or continue to do that action less. And when we think about positive and negative reinforcement, these terms are bandied about quite a bit. And in some ways, they're used properly at times, and other times they're really not used properly. But let's talk a little bit. What is positive and negative reinforcement? Instead of just meaning good or bad, positive means to give, and it means to give some sort of reward. Negative reinforcement means to take away some sort of pain, some sort of bad thing. And by these two things kind of working in concert with one another, we are able to, kind of condition ourselves like, what is good, what is bad? What do we like, what do we don't like? What should we continue to do, what should we avoid doing? Like when it comes to positive reinforcement, you're working hard, you're studying for a test, you do well, you get a good grade, you get this sort of like cheers, pat on the back sort of thing, and you start to associate success in a very positive way. Success means something good for you, even though this is not always the case, of course, because there can be a variety of different responses. But this sort of like kudos, this sort of rewards that you're getting, the pat on the back, the well done, the job well done, cheerio, sir, is a form of positive reinforcement. Like giving a dog a treat whenever they do something correctly, positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is kind of like the taking away of something bad. Like, for example, if you are to have like a headache, so you're in this sort of pain, you obviously don't like it, you want it to go away, and so you take some aspirin, and the aspirin takes away the pain. This is negative reinforcement. It's still reinforcing the behavior of taking the aspirin, but doing so by not positively, not giving you something, by taking away something that's bad. And so this sort of like negative reinforcement is, again, like the removal of bad things. Like if you are in the principal's office and, you're told you'll get out of this if you tell the truth. Telling the truth, they're trying to negatively reinforce telling the truth. They will remove this sort of punished condition if you practice honesty. Now, punishment, on the other hand, is oftentimes, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit. Do we talk about? Yes, we do talk about punishment more. Punishment is something where you're giving sort of negative stimulus, and that has its own forms of complication that we'll address in just a couple minutes. Now, oftentimes associated with operant conditioning is the Skinner box. And to kind of typify what this is, the Skinner box is this sort of contraption that B.F. Skinner created, who was kind of the father of behaviorism here in America. But it's this box where if the mouse turns the wheel, the food pellet comes out. And this is just a classical example of positive reinforcement. Every time he turns the wheel so much, food pellet comes out. So he's being rewarded for this sort of activity. And if he stops doing this activity, he stops getting his reward. And so what you see is this just sort of creative loop where the animal is able to get that sort of immediate recognition, which is an important thing as we talk about in the text will remind us in terms of timing and immediacy. It's actually important to associate a sort of immediacy with the sort of reinforcement that you want to do. And this is what the Skinner box was doing. And, there was even attempts at building like human Skinner boxes that would reinforce positive thinking, creative thinking, spatial, modal thinking in children, which is something that we kind of do today in, informational games and the like, where you see a sort of like solve the puzzle on your little iPad, and then balloons and smiley faces and hat and fireworks shoot out. Again, that's just using positive reinforcement to kind of like encourage good behavior or encourage the right sort of behavior that the person designing the tool is trying to achieve. But when it comes to reinforcement, timing is a very, very big deal. Like if you were going to punish your pet for going to the bathroom on the carpet, it is not very effective to punish them after the action has taken place, like a long time later. If you walk into the house after being gone for all afternoon and you find your pet went to the bathroom inside the house, rubbing its nose in it is not going to be a hugely effective way of accomplishing that goal, just because there's been such a divorce between the action and this sort of reinforcer that you're not achieving you're not going to, statistically speaking, not achieve what you want to achieve. Whereas a much more effective way would be if you see the animal doing that, if you're going to punish them immediately. If you want to provide a positive thing like, going to the bathroom or performing a trick, you give that reinforcer right away so that the reinforcement is being connected immediately with the action. And that's something to keep in mind, especially when we talk a little bit in just a few minutes about like punishing children. So when we think about these sort of reinforcers, the type of stuff that will be directing and enforcing or reinforcing behaviors in our day-to-day life, we have several different types. We have primary reinforcers, secondary reinforcers, and then social. And social is the most complicated of them all because it's kind of like showing how entangled or ensconced all our behavior is in one another. But more simplistically speaking, primary reinforcers are reinforcers that speak to a physiological need. Reinforcers like feeling good when you go to sleep or eating a meal, or if you hold your breath for a really, really long time like you're underwater, that first breath when you come up is very refreshing. Or, if you've been working out or been on a long run, or it's just a really hot day, that sort of first gulp of water is really, really sort of refreshing. And these are all sorts of like primary reinforcers. The type of stuff that's very simple, very straightforward. Like the feeding of the treat to the dog is for the most part a primary reinforcer. Though some people, we might want to argue that, well, the dog is really just there for your approval, and your happiness leads to his happiness. That can be the case. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But the bacon strips help a lot. The fake bacon. The dogs love that fake bacon, so they're highly motivated by that sort of reinforcer. Secondary reinforcers are the type of things that reinforce our higher mental processes. Things like our self-affirmation, our confidence, our emotions, our love, our pride, our self-image. These sort of secondary reinforcers are things that directly affect us. That sort of attaboy. And these are things that are addressing our needs, but when we start to talk about Maslow in the distant future, we'll kind of get on this. These are the higher order needs that it is addressing and encouraging in terms of our behaviors. But lastly, the most complicated one, and we could probably spend a month just kind of dissecting this, would be social reinforcers. This kind of gets us very quickly into the Althusserian territory of ISAs and RSAs, which is ideological and repressive state apparatus. And he has this whole theory on what helps control a populace to continually perform its existing orders is through this idea of social reinforcers, these ideological apparatus that when you are told to sit down in class and you sit or you get punished, that is the sort of social reinforcer that's conditioning you for a lifetime of making sure that you sit down when told, that you conform when told. And it's much more complicated and fascinating than this, but it's the sort of basic social conditioning that prepares us to basically perform the status quo, continually perform the status quo. And why would we want to perform the status quo? Because it's the status quo. Because change can be dangerous. Even as we say change can be positive, it can also be very negative, especially when society is looking at the power of the haves and the have-nots in this sort of like overarching Marxist argument, which we're not going to even touch on. But Althusser kind of builds a case that these sort of social reinforcers are one of the most important facets of maintaining that sort of cycle of behaviors in the populace. So one of the things that now I want to turn our attention to as we kind of draw towards the end here is the issue of punishment. How punishment takes place, how punishment is effective, and what punishment both can and cannot effectively do. Because punishment is kind of in many ways a little hot topic. It's a hot topic of what will and won't work. And it's very much debated between this sort of like psychological approach and then like a common sense approach. Not that the two are holistically at odds with one another, but there is also a sort of cultural difference between what people think might work and what actually seems to be proven or demonstrated to work from a psychological standpoint. So, one of the things that we talked about, when it comes to punishment, immediacy is one of the more effective ways or effective mechanisms of actually changing behavior when it comes to producing punishment. Punishment that comes, hours, days, weeks, months later, will not necessarily actually alter the behavior of the individual as effectively as punishment right then and there. Um, so like in the case of a dog wants to come sniff at your table, for food scraps. If you want to discourage that behavior, you want to maybe spray water in their face, is the example our textbook gives. But to do that right away, we do not do that like it comes up and you just let it sniff for a while, you let it sniff for a while, and then eventually like, no. Well, what you did was you just allowed that sort of behavior to take place, and then eventually you shoo it away. Well, that's not a good way of handling it. Or like in the case of going to the bathroom on the inside the house, if you want to, go outside, you don't just wait till the end of the day and be like, oh, by the way, dog, bad. Not only is the dog not speaking our language, but it's not going to associate the punishment with the action. And so, like the whole trope of you'll be sorry when your dad gets home, kind of can in some ways create a detrimental reinforcement loop rather than a sort of changing enforcement loop. Because, by the time your dad gets home and punishes you, you're not going to be able to, you won't as firmly associate the punishment with the behavior as you would have if there had been some sort of immediacy to that punishment. Though some would say also, that the punishment of dread, knowing that your dad is coming home, might be a sort of immediacy in its own right. Now, also when we're talking about punishment is that, I put here that we're building a wall to let the thieves know where to rob, and that's an old Taoist proverb. But when we are starting to punish, especially from a sort of like physical punishment standpoint, we are starting to model the behavior for other people. And so we are setting all at once the tone of what is acceptable. And so, if you're aggressive and violent with a kid, there's a good possibility that the kid will in turn emulate the aggressive and violent behavior. And this is the sort of, by punishing a behavior, you can actually continue to incite it if you do so poorly. And then there also can be tertiary responses to punishment. It's been recorded that kids that are punished physically or way strongly can have aggression. And this is a sort of natural response. As a kid, if you get spanked really hard, you're gonna be like, oh no, have a hostile sort of reaction to that. And you could have a sort of knee-jerk response to any sort of future engagement that might cause that. And so they've observed that kids that are corporeally punished could have higher instances of aggression. That being said, the book is clear to note, because I'm sure there are a lot of us that are like myself, who were spanked, etc., and aren't like overly aggressive. There is not like a true causal link between spanking your kid and psychological damage. In fact, just kind of looking at effective punishment versus ineffective punishment, because one of the things our book also talks about is being very clear in what forms of punishment we might and might not give. I could think of, there's two very distinct responses or types of corporeal punishment that oftentimes took place in my household. My father had this very measured, very controlled, almost kind of rational approach to punishment. If there was behavior that he sought to correct, he would outline the punishment that was being received and then implement said punishment. And the weird thing he did was like he would spank you, and then if like you flinched or tried to get away, he would add spankings to it. So you kind of had this sort of, I'm going to take it like a man and just get through it, and punishment achieved, and we're moving on. My mother had a much more kind of like aggressive, angry method of when something upset her, she would get upset and then lash out. clearly you should be able to hopefully see which one of these a psychologist would say is more effective than the other. Um, and it's that measured response is going to be effective, whereas the anger, the kind of wrathful lashing out at the kid is going to sit there and be like, what have I done wrong? What is going on? Struggling. You're a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, and you're trying to comprehend complex emotions from an adult while at the same time receiving a sort of corporeal physical punishment. Associatively linking the two, and this becomes a very ineffective method of punishing your kids. Because the lessons that you learn is don't cross mom, but you don't know exactly what crosses mom. And so it puts you in a place of fear rather than in a place of nurturing. You're not improving your behaviors. You're kind of just learning to avoid. And so that's kind of a very important lesson to kind of learn as parents, or just in general, because likewise, those sorts of lessons, if you ever find yourself in any sort of leadership or authority figure, this issue of how do we punish and motivate the people underneath us in a work environment are going to be very, very important. So lastly, the last thing we want to talk about today is cognitive and observational learning. Mainly today we've been talking about kind of associative learning, and the two main kind of like categorizations of associative learning is classical and operant. And hopefully by now we have kind of a good grasp on these two central approaches to associative learning, but keep in mind that there are other forms of learning, and this is really just kind of that scientific approach towards characterizing learning, not even talking about learning like intuitive learning or instinctual learning. But cognitive learning is the sort of learning that takes place at a cognizant, at an intellectual level. And in many ways can be driven by, the first thing here is curiosity. This sort of curiosity that has us asking questions. Why do things work the way they work? One of the most foundational things about humans is that we have a sort of inquisitive mind that is looking not only at the puzzle of associative learning, the risk, rewards, and pleasures that come from that, but also trying to figure out, why does this thing exist in the first place? We will. It's this thing that takes us from eating dead animals to cooking dead animals, and then starting to understand, why do we do that, and why does that process make it better, which allows us to create multiple orders of learning going on, because we're looking at the associative qualities, but we're also looking at things from this sort of curiosity that drives our cognitive thinking and our cognitive learning. Another form of cognitive learning comes through like spatial. Well, I call it spatial, but it's kind of like mental mapping, cognitive mapping, which is our way of organizing. Which is kind of the cool thing about humans that we do so well, is organizing information into discrete units that can be manipulated and reasoned with. This kind of goes back towards something that Piaget talked about when it came to his cognitive development, is all about learning how to create models for reasoning and models for thinking. And this comes back to our ability to map things out in our mind. Say we're going to be going to school. It's not just, for a little bit we might have I hop on this bus and hop on this train, but eventually we start to map out in our head, what are we passing by? What are we doing? You start to manipulate mentally and spatially the world around you. And this too is a very, very important part about what it means for human reasoning, and one of the things that kind of differentiates us in cool ways for how we actually know things around us. And then last couple things that are important when we come to cognitive learning, just kind of at the superficial 5 minutes we're giving this, is feedback, and then rote and conceptual learning. Feedback is the sort of encouragement to learn more, and encouragement to pursue this avenue versus that avenue, or like when you're kind of having a conversation with someone and you see their response, well, that's a sort of feedback to the conversation you're having, to the ideas you're expressing, and your ability to pick up on that and learn from that is again part of this cognitive process, so that you're able to associate ideas or responses with conceptual ideas, and not just this sort of classical conditioning response. But no, you're actually looking at the feedback and saying, what does this mean? What does feedback mean, and how does it improve what I'm trying to learn and how I'm trying to learn? And then lastly, we have rote and conceptual learning. Rote learning is the type of thing that we ask you to do. And when we're talking about our midterm, like I said, there's an element of this that's going to be rote. I'm going to say, what are the 4 aims of psychology? And you're going to have to be able to produce rotely, describing and understanding, and predicting and controlling. And these are things I want you to be able to say. 1, 2, 3, 4. Rote. To reproduce automatically. But there's also another element to that, and that's conceptual learning. And these are two very different facets of learning, but they also support each other in kind of interesting ways. Without the sort of conceptual or theoretical learning, the rote learning doesn't have meaning. But without the rote learning, the conceptual learning doesn't have shape. So when we're talking about, you've heard the phrase, the devil's in the details. Well, we have grand ideas, but those details must be worked out. But if you only focus on the details, the grand ideas do not take shape. And it's through that combination of theoretical and material learning that we're able to really process things. Last thing to kind of close out, just kind of a foreshadowing of other types of learning. This was kind of important, and we didn't, it's one of the things that we just never have enough time for. But observational learning, there was a lot of work that was done in the mid-20th century to kind of show that children learn through the sort of environment that they're in, through observing the behaviors of others and then replicating that behavior, even without being given the stimulus directly to do so. And so that our children become these sort of byproducts of the culture in which they are living. They observe the world around them, So, we watch our TV shows and we're seeing models of how to live and how to be. And these are the sort of things that are, and again, this kind of goes back to that segue out of into Althusser that I offered, but it's a form of ideological thinking that drives us into behaving in the way in which we observe. So we see our idols, we see our heroes, and we say, yeah, we're going to be like that, but not at necessarily a direct, oh, let me list out the attributes of what it looks like to be this person. Instead, we start to just kind of take in, unconsciously perhaps, the sort of behaviors and mannerisms and actions that they do. And that can be good stuff, it can be bad stuff. Something like holding the door. Oh, that's a good, thing that we observe, and so we're going to perform it. But also in a number of other ways. Like, I know whenever I meet new friends, I will sometimes adopt some of their little phrases that they say, the little turns of phrase, or some of their mannerisms. And this comes as a process of like observational learning. We're seeing and we're mimicking, and that drives our behavior as well. So we're going to end there. Again, let's hopefully all get ready for the midterm that's coming up. Hope you guys have a great week, and stay vigilant with all the normal things.